1957. Genovese sent his deadliest hitman straight at Bumpy Johnson. 6 weeks later, a coffin landed at his own social club, 11:43 p.m. Inside, not a corpse, a living man, a running recorder, and enough evidence to shatter everything. How did the man sent to end Bumpy walk back and bury the boss who sent him? The hallway smelled like bleach and death. White lights buzzed overhead, the kind that never go dark, the kind that make every shadow look like a bruise. A clock on the wall ticked every second like a small hammer driving a nail into the floor. Nobody talked in this hallway. There was nothing left to say. He sat alone on a metal chair outside the surgery room. His hands were flat on his knees. His eyes were fixed on the door in front of him. Behind that door, his 9-year-old daughter was being opened up by strangers who had already told him what they expected to find. The doctor hadn't softened it. He'd looked him straight in the eye and said, "Without the full treatment cycle, Clara has 6 weeks, maybe less. The leukemia is moving faster than we anticipated." 6 weeks, $60,000. 2 numbers that had been carved into his chest since that conversation and hadn't stopped burning. He had called every man he'd ever worked with, every contact, every connection, every favor owed across 20 years of pulling triggers for people who preferred to keep their hands clean. Every single door shut in his face the moment he said the number. 60,000 was too much. 6 weeks was too short. A dying child was too complicated. On the 4th night, someone knocked on his apartment door at 11 p.m. The man who walked in wore a gray suit with no wrinkles and no expression. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't look around the apartment. He sat down at the kitchen table like he'd been there 100 times before, reached into his jacket, and placed a brown envelope on the table between them. He left his hand resting on top of it. 30,000 now, the man said. 30 more when the job is finished. No bank, no record, no questions afterward. The hitman didn't touch the envelope. What's the job? The man in the gray suit pulled a photograph from his jacket and placed it face up on the table, black and white. A heavy-set black man in his 50s, standing on a Harlem street corner with his arms crossed and his jaw set like he was daring the entire city to try something. The kind of face that had looked at danger so many times it had stopped flinching. "His name is Ellsworth Johnson," the man said. "They call him Bumpy. He controls Harlem. Has for 20 years. Our employer wants him removed. Clean. No trace, no noise." The hitman stared at the photograph. He knew that name. Everyone in New York knew that name. Bumpy Johnson had survived 3 hits before most men in that business survived their first. He wasn't just a man. He was a wall with eyes. "That's not a simple job," the hitman said. "No," the man in the gray suit agreed. "That's why it pays 60,000. The hitman looked down the hallway toward the door at the end, still closed. The clock was still hammering. Clara was still behind that door with machines breathing for her. He picked up the envelope. The moment his fingers closed around it, something invisible locked around his throat. He didn't feel it yet. He wouldn't feel it for weeks. But Vito Genovese's world worked exactly one way. Money moved in one direction, and the man who received it never got to decide when the transaction was finished. The envelope wasn't payment. It was a leash, handed to a desperate man in a hospital hallway who was too broken to recognize the difference. In the 1950s, these arrangements left no paper trail. But the bodies they produced always surfaced eventually in police reports, in morgue files, in the memories of men who spent the rest of their lives trying to forget what they'd seen. A murder contract doesn't begin with a gunshot. It begins with a father sitting under fluorescent lights, listening to a clock tick, making the only choice he believes he has left. He was right that the money was real. He was wrong about everything that came after it. Harlem at 6 in the morning smelled like yesterday's rain and frying oil and cigarette smoke that had soaked into the brick so deep it would never come out. The street was not quiet. It was just slower trucks rolling past, a woman sweeping her stoop, a radio playing something low and bluesy from a window 2 floors up. The city was warming up its engine. Bumpy Johnson sat at his corner table at a small restaurant on 116th Street. Same table he'd used every Tuesday and Thursday for 11 years. Coffee, black, no sugar. The same view of the same block. Routine wasn't laziness. Routine was a trap he set for people who thought they understood him. He noticed the man across the street at 6:22 in the morning. Brown coat. Newspaper. Standing near the corner like he was waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. Most men wouldn't have looked twice. The man was still, patient, gave nothing away. But in 40 minutes, the newspaper had not moved a single page, and 3 times his eyes had drifted upward, just for a second, just long enough to ward Bumpy's window. Bumpy picked up his coffee and didn't look away from the street. "Carl," he said quietly to the man sitting across from him. The one in the brown coat. "Don't touch him. Don't follow him close enough for him to feel it. I want to know who he talked to in the last 2 days, and I want to know what's bleeding in his personal life, not his work. His life." Carl glanced out the window. "You think he's moving on you?" "I think he's the opening sentence of a paragraph somebody else wrote," Bumpy said. "I want to read the whole page before they think I've seen the first line." By that evening, Carl had a thread. A payphone on Mulberry Street. A parking garage meeting in the Bronx. Faces that matched the men who ran Genovese's street-level operations. The picture was forming, and it was not subtle. Genovese wanted Bumpy gone, and he'd sent someone from outside the usual circles to do it quietly. 2 days later, Carl brought back something nobody had expected. The man had a daughter. 9 years old. Leukemia. He had taken the contract because he needed $60,000 in 6 weeks or she was going to die in a hospital bed while he sat in a metal chair outside the door. Bumpy was quiet for a long time when he heard that. The room waited. Then he leaned forward and spoke in a voice that didn't rise above a conversation. "That man is not a professional doing a job. That man is a father with a gun and nothing left to protect except one person. And he already knows he might not save her. You understand what that makes him? That makes him the most dangerous thing walking. Because he has already made his peace with dying. The only thing still holding him together is that little girl." He sat back, which means a bullet doesn't stop him. Desperation doesn't negotiate with bullets. We stop him by offering him the one thing Genovese never put on the table, a reason to stay alive. No document ever placed ownership of Harlem in Bumpy Johnson's name. But every journalist, every federal file, every street-level account from that decade pointed to the same unmovable truth. His grip on that neighborhood was not enforced through fear alone. It was enforced through knowledge. He knew who was hungry, who was desperate, who was lying, and who was about to break before they knew it themselves. Real power is not the gun in the room. Real power is already knowing whose hand is shaking before they reach for it. The hitman thought he had been tracking Bumpy Johnson for 2 weeks. He had no idea that from the moment he took his position across the street on a Tuesday morning with a newspaper he never read, he had been the one being studied. The Red Rooster smelled like bourbon and candle wax, and 100 cigarettes burned down to nothing over years of late nights. The lights were the color of old whiskey amber, low, the kind that softened every face in the room and made the whole place feel like a confession booth where nobody was keeping records. A trumpet in the corner was playing something slow enough to make a man feel like time had stopped. The hitman arrived at 10:47 p.m. and ordered a drink he didn't touch. He had spent 2 weeks mapping this night. Bumpy came to the Red Rooster every Thursday. Same table in the back left corner. Stayed until midnight. Left through the side door onto the alley. The pattern was clean. Consistent. Almost careless, the kind of routine that told the hitman this man had grown comfortable. Comfortable men made mistakes. 3 feet of distance, 1 bullet at the base of the skull. The trumpet would cover the sound. He'd be through the side door and gone before the glass hit the floor. Bumpy walked in at 11:05 and sat down exactly where he was supposed to sit. The hitman's right hand moved slowly toward his jacket. At 11:22 p.m., a full tray of glasses detonated against the hardwood floor directly behind him. The crack of it split the room open. Every head snapped toward the sound. The trumpet stuttered. The whole crowd lurched sideways for 3 full seconds. When the hitman turned back toward the rear table, Bumpy Johnson was looking straight at him, not at the fallen tray, not at the crowd. Straight at him. His expression had not changed. His body had not moved. He looked like a man who had set his watch to this exact moment and was simply confirming it had arrived on time. The hitman's hand froze inside his jacket. Bumpy raised his glass slowly. 1 inch. A signal. And 2 men at separate tables on opposite sides of the room stood up simultaneously and moved to the bar, positioning themselves on either side of the hitman without a word, without a rush, without a single gesture that the rest of the room would notice. Nobody drew a weapon. Nobody raised a voice. The trumpet resumed. The amber light didn't change. But the hitman understood with complete and sickening clarity that the exits had just closed around him like a fist. Bumpy walked to the bar and sat down on the stool directly beside him. Their shoulders were 8 inches apart. He didn't look at the man. He stared at the bottles behind the bar and spoke in a voice that stayed just below the music. Clara, 9 years old, Harlem Hospital, 3rd floor, room 11, leukemia, aggressive strain, 3 weeks admitted, deteriorating faster than the first prognosis suggested. Genovese's man gave you $30,000 in a brown envelope at your kitchen table 4 days ago and promised 30 more when you finished the job. He picked up his drink and took 1 slow sip. I want you to sit with the fact that I know your daughter's room number and I'm still the one talking to you right now instead of having what's left of you poured into the street. The hitman could not move his hand, could not speak. The way Bumpy had said Clara's name without cruelty, without theater. Just a fact stated plainly in the middle of a jazz club had locked every muscle in his body more completely than a gun pressed to his temple could have. Genovese was never going to pay you the second $30,000, Bumpy continued. The moment you pulled that trigger, his next phone call would have been to someone who makes loose ends disappear. You, Clara, anyone who knew your name. That's not a theory. That's how that man has operated for 30 years, and the people who trusted him are not around to argue otherwise. He finally turned and looked at the hitman directly. His eyes were not angry. Anger would have been easier to survive. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had already seen every possible ending to this story and was offering. Out of something that had no clean name. One exit that didn't end in a morgue. You were sent here to end me. Instead, you're going to help me end something much larger. And when it's done, Clara gets her $60,000, all of it from a source that doesn't require you to put a bullet in anyone. No police report confirmed what happened at the Red Rooster that Thursday night. But years later, in separate interviews, 3 men who had been in that room described the same detail independently. A hitman sitting completely still at a bar while Bumpy Johnson spoke to him quietly, and the way the man's shoulders dropped at some point during that conversation, like something structural inside him had finally given way. The perfect trap is not the cage that closes around its target by force. It is the one the target builds himself, step by careful step. believing with total confidence that every decision was his own, right up until the moment the door shuts and he realizes the blueprint was never his to begin with. No gunshot, no shouting, no violence of any kind. Just a small room above a laundromat on 118th Street, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, and the sound of a reel-to-reel recorder turning slowly on a table between two men. The hitman sat in a wooden chair with his coat still on. His hands were on his knees. He had not slept in 31 hours. His eyes were red at the edges and his jaw was tight, and he smelled like cigarettes, and the particular kind of sweat that comes not from heat, but from fear that has been sitting in a man's body for too long. Bumpy sat across from him and pressed play. The recording was grainy, voices overlapping, the ambient noise of what sounded like a back room somewhere, dishes, a door closing, men talking in the flat, casual tone of people who believed absolutely that no one was listening. Then one voice came through cleaner than the rest, a voice the hitman recognized immediately because he had sat across a kitchen table from the man it belonged to and shaken his hand and accepted $30,000 from his envelope. The voice said, "When it's done, we clean the whole thing. Johnson, the shooter's family. No loose thread, no hospital record, nothing that connects back. You understand what I'm telling you? All of it, done the same night." The recorder kept turning. The room was completely silent except for that sound, that mechanical, indifferent turning like a clock that didn't care what time it was marking. The hitman did not move for a long time. His daughter's name had been in that sentence, not spoken out loud, but it was there, folded inside the words "shooter's family," like a knife inside a handshake. "How long have you had that?" he finally said. "Long enough," Bumpy answered. "That's my daughter he's talking about erasing," the hitman said. His voice did not break. It went the opposite direction. It flattened out, went cold, the way a man's voice goes when emotion has burned completely through and left nothing behind but clarity. "Yes," Bumpy said. "It is." The hitman stood up from the chair slowly, the way a man stands when his legs are not entirely sure they want to hold him. He walked to the window and looked down at the street below. A woman was hanging laundry on a fire escape across the alley. A kid was bouncing a rubber ball against a stoop. The world outside was completely ordinary and had absolutely no interest in what was being destroyed inside this room. "He was never going to pay me the second 30, the hitman said. It wasn't a question. He was just hearing himself say it out loud for the first time, pressing on it like a bruise to confirm it was real. "He was going to use the second 30 as the reason to call you back in," Bumpy said. "Get you somewhere quiet, somewhere clean, somewhere nobody would find the mess until it was too late to matter. You were never a hired gun to Genovese. You were a problem he was solving in 2 steps. Step 1 was you killing me. Step 2 was someone else killing you. Clara was insurance that you wouldn't run before step 1 was finished." The hitman turned from the window. Something in his face had reorganized itself. The desperation that had been there since the hospital hallway, that raw, cornered animal look of a man with nothing left, had been replaced by something harder and much more dangerous. "So what do you want from me?" he said. Bumpy looked at him steadily. "I want you to stay alive long enough to be useful. And then I want you to walk into a room with me and let Genovese see exactly what he tried to bury." Men in that world had been recording conversations since the early 1950s. Not for courts, not for newspapers, but for leverage. A good recording was worth more than a gun because a gun could only threaten a man's body. A recording could threaten everything he had built, every alliance he had made. Every man who had ever trusted him with something he didn't want repeated. In the most dangerous world on earth, the most dangerous man is never the one holding the gun. It is always the one who already knows you were planning to use it and has been recording the conversation the entire time. The hitman was not a killer anymore. He was evidence. And evidence, in the right hands, at the right moment, in the right room, could do more damage than any bullet ever cast. The Paradise Club on a Thursday night smelled like cigar smoke so thick it had texture, like you could reach out and grab a handful of it. The lights were the color of old gold, dim, heavy, the kind of light that made every man in the room look like he was already hiding something. Glasses of dark liquor sat on tables covered in green felt. Conversations ran low and close, mouths near ears. Words meant for one person and nobody else. Bumpy sat in a corner booth with two men he trusted completely and laid out what was about to happen. "We do not shoot back," he said. "We do not send a message through somebody's window or somebody's kneecap. The moment we pick up a gun, we are playing his game on his board and he has more pieces than we do. That is not how this ends." One of the men across from him, a broad-shouldered man named Walter, who had been with Bumpy for 15 years, leaned forward. "So we let him walk away from sending a shooter into Harlem. We let that stand." "We let him think it's standing," Bumpy said. "Right up until the moment he's sitting in front of his own men and realizes it never was." The plan was not complicated. It was surgical. Genovese operated through reputation, his capos, his lieutenants. Every man in his organization believed in him because he had never been visibly outmaneuvered. He had never been caught making a mistake in front of people who mattered. His authority ran on that belief the way an engine runs on fuel. Remove the fuel and the engine doesn't just slow down, it stops. The plan had three pieces: keep the hitman alive and visible. Choose a location where Genovese's own people would be present. Walk the hitman into that location and let the room understand without a single direct accusation exactly what had been attempted. Exactly how completely it had failed, and exactly who had been in control of the situation from the beginning. No gunfight, no bodies, just a room full of men watching a boss who had sent his best move against Bumpy Johnson receive that move back. Intact, unharmed, and carrying a recorder that had been running since the night of the contract. Walter sat back in his chair slowly. "You're going to make him look weak in front of his own captains." "I'm going to let the facts make him look weak," Bumpy said. "I'm just going to make sure the facts are in the room at the right time." Over the following days, something began moving through Genovese's organization, the way smoke moves through a building before anyone smells the fire quiet. Invisible. Impossible to locate, but impossible to stop. Whispers. Questions passed between men at the margins of conversations. Had the job in Harlem gone wrong? Had the shooter flipped? Was there a recording? Nobody said Genovese's name directly. Nobody had to. In an organization built entirely on the belief that the man at the top was untouchable, doubt does not announce itself. It moves in the dark, through small conversations, through the way a man hesitates before he answers a direct question, through the half-second pause before loyalty that used to be instant. No written plan was ever produced. No document outlined the sequence of what followed. But every event that came after that Thursday night at the Paradise Club unfolded in a direction that was too precise, too coordinated, and too damaging to have been accidental. Losing money costs a man his comfort. Losing men costs a man his army. But losing face in front of the people who built their lives on believing in you, that costs a man the only thing that was ever holding any of it together. Humiliation, delivered quietly and in public, is not an insult. It is a structural collapse. And Bumpy Johnson had just laid the charges at the foundation. The card table smelled like red wine and cigarette ash and the particular sourness of men who had been sitting in a closed room for too long. Green felt on the table, poker chips stacked in uneven towers, a bottle of Chianti on its side, a dark stain spreading slowly across the felt like a bruise opening up. The room was in the back of a social club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, the kind of room where serious men had serious conversations, and the walls had heard things that would have ended careers and lives if they had ever been repeated outside. There were 6 men in the room when the knock came at the door. Not the front door, the back door, the one that opened onto the service alley, the one that only people who already knew the layout of the building would know to use. One of Genovese's men opened it. 2 of Bumpy's people were standing in the alley. Between them, on a small wheeled cart, was a wooden coffin. Plain pine. No markings. The kind used for men whose families couldn't afford anything better, or for men whose families weren't supposed to know where they ended up. The room went completely silent. Cards stopped moving. Hands froze above chips. Every man at that table had enough experience with violent death to understand immediately what a coffin arriving unannounced at a back door meant, and every one of them felt the cold move through the room like something physical. Genovese's man said nothing. He stepped back. Bumpy's people wheeled the coffin inside and stopped it in the center of the room, directly under the overhead light. Then one of them reached down and unlatched the lid. The man inside was alive. He was sitting upright, blinking against the sudden light, his face pale and damp with sweat, his hands folded in his lap. He was the hitman, the man Genovese had paid $30,000 to put Bumpy Johnson in the ground. He was breathing. He was intact, and resting against his chest, held in place by one hand, was a reel-to-reel recording device that was still running. Nobody at that card table said a word. The hitman looked around the room slowly. When his eyes found the face of Genovese's man, the same man in the gray suit who had sat at his kitchen table and placed the brown envelope between them, he held the eye contact and did not look away. "He said you were going to pay me the second $30,000, the hitman said, loud enough for every man in that room to hear clearly. "He also said on this recording that you were going to have me and my daughter removed the same night the job was finished. I want everyone in this room to understand that I did not come here angry. I came here so that everyone in this room would know exactly what kind of man makes that kind of promise." The gray suit man's face did not move, but something behind his eyes shifted a crack. Barely visible. The kind that appears in a wall right before the whole section gives way. In the Sicilian tradition that underpinned the American mob structure, a boss was not merely a man with power. He was a man whose word was iron. A man who could not be manipulated, could not be outthought, could not be made to look foolish in front of the men who served him. The moment that image cracked, not through violence, not through arrest, but through a room full of his own people watching a dead man arrive alive and start talking, the authority began to bleed out in a way that no amount of violence could repair. The coffin sat in the middle of that room for a long time after everyone had gone quiet. The recording kept turning. The wine stain kept spreading across the green felt, and every man at that table did the same private calculation, measuring what they believed about the man they worked for against what they had just seen with their own eyes. A boss does not fear the gun pointed at his chest. A gun is clean. It's direct. It ends in one direction or another and the story is finished. What a boss cannot survive is the moment his own men look at him and see, for the first time, something smaller than what they believed was there. That night in Little Italy, nobody fired a shot. Nobody threw a punch. Nobody was arrested or threatened or touched. But something died in that room that no amount of money or muscle would ever bring back. The meeting room had no windows, no clocks on the wall, no food on the table. Just 6 men sitting in wooden chairs around a bare table in a basement somewhere in Lower Manhattan. And the kind of silence that only exists between people who have all seen enough violence to know exactly what it costs and exactly when it stops being worth the price. Nobody shouted. Nobody slammed a fist down. That was not how these men operated. Rage was for street corners and bar rooms. In a room like this one, with men like these, everything moved through the voice flat, controlled, precise, and the most dangerous sentences were always the quietest ones. One of the men, older, heavy set. A commission representative who had been in that world since before most of the others were shaving, placed both hands flat on the table and spoke first. What happened in that room on Mulberry Street does not leave this conversation. What we are deciding right now is not about pride, and it is not about Genovese's feelings. What we are deciding is whether the money keeps moving or whether we burn 6 years of structure in Harlem because one man's operation got embarrassed. Across the table, one of Genovese's people, a thin man with a scar along his left jawline who never used more words than necessary, said, "You let this stand. You're telling every independent operator in every borough that they can humiliate a family and walk away clean. That invitation does not stay in Harlem. It spreads." The older man looked at him without blinking. "Nobody walked away clean. That's the point you're missing. Johnson didn't fire a shot, didn't take a body, didn't make a public accusation. He walked a man into a room and let the room draw its own conclusions. You cannot retaliate against that without confirming everything the room already suspects. You hit back now. You are telling every one of those men at that table that what they saw was real enough to be worth a war." The thin man was quiet for a moment. "Then, so we do nothing. We protect the revenue," the older man said. "Harlem runs $30,000 a week through numbers alone. The policy banks, the street-level collections, the arrangements that have been in place since 1950, all of it functions because the current structure holds. You crack the structure to satisfy one man's damaged reputation, and you are not hurting Johnson. You are cutting your own income and handing the disorder to people who will not manage it as cleanly as he has." The room stayed quiet for a long time after that. Not the quiet of agreement, the quiet of men doing arithmetic, measuring the cost of action against the cost of stillness, calculating what a war in Harlem would disrupt, how long it would take to rebuild, how many moving pieces would come loose in the process. The thin man picked up his glass, looked at the contents, and set it back down without drinking. "Genovese is not going to accept this quietly." "Genovese," the older man said, with a deliberateness that made the name sound like a closing door, "is going to accept what the numbers tell him to accept, same as the rest of us. What was said in that basement was never written down. No transcript, no record, no minutes from a meeting that officially never happened. But the outcome was documented plainly, and everything that followed Harlem's operational structure remained unchanged through the remainder of the decade. No war was opened. No retaliation was carried out against Bumpy Johnson or anyone connected to him. The machinery kept running exactly as it had been running before the Coffin arrived on Mulberry Street, in an organization built by violent men who had spent their lives taking what they wanted by force. The decision to absorb an insult and protect a revenue stream was not weakness. It was the coldest possible form of intelligence. And it confirmed something that Bumpy Johnson had understood for years before anyone in that basement was willing to say it out loud. In the end, every organization, no matter how brutal, no matter how powerful, no matter how much blood it has spilled to get where it is, will always choose the money. Every single time. Pride is expensive. Ego is expensive. Revenge is the most expensive thing a man can buy. And the bill always comes due at the worst possible moment. The commission chose the money. Genovese was left to absorb the damage in silence, and Harlem kept running. 6 in the morning. The surgery floor of Harlem Hospital smelled like antiseptic and recycled air and the specific exhaustion of a building that never fully sleeps. The overhead lights were the same brutal white they always were. The floor was the same pale green linoleum, scuffed from years of gurneys and footsteps, and the quiet back and forth of people moving between rooms where life and death were being negotiated in equal measure. The surgeon came through the double doors at 6:14 a.m. He pulled his mask down and looked at the hitman, who had been sitting in the same metal chair for 4 hours without moving, and said, "She came through. The treatment is working. If the next 2 weeks hold, we're looking at a real recovery." The hitman put his face in his hands. He did not make a sound. His shoulders moved once, then went still. When he lifted his head, his eyes were dry, but something behind them had changed in a way that could not be reversed. Clara was alive. The $60,000 had arrived in cash, unmarked, delivered to the hospital billing office 2 days earlier by a man no one at the hospital had seen before or would see again. The account was settled. The treatment was fully funded. No explanation, no name attached. The hitman knew exactly where it had come from. He had asked Bumpy directly, the night after the meeting on Mulberry Street, sat across from him in the same small room above the laundromat and said, "Why I came to Harlem to put a bullet in the back of your head. You had every reason to let my daughter die and me with her. Why did you cover it?" Bumpy looked at him for a moment before answering. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had thought about this question long before it was ever asked. "Because you didn't come after me, because you wanted to. You came after me because somebody handed a desperate man a gun and pointed him in a direction and called it a contract. That's not a killer. That's a father who ran out of options. I've seen what this city does to men who run out of options, and I don't add to that count when I don't have to." He paused. "But understand something clearly. This does not make us even. This does not erase what you were willing to do or what you almost did. Clara being alive is not forgiveness. It is a decision I made because it was the right decision. What you do with the rest of your life is entirely your own business." The hitman and his daughter left New York within the week. No forwarding address, no phone number, no contact with anyone connected to either Harlem or Mulberry Street. They disappeared into the ordinary American landscape the way people do when they have been given a second chance. They know they do not deserve quietly. Quickly. Without looking back. Over the years that followed, stories accumulated around Bumpy Johnson's name in Harlem, a family whose rent was covered when the father went to prison, a kid whose hospital bill vanished without explanation, a woman whose debt to the wrong people was quietly absorbed by someone she never met face to face. None of these stories appeared in any financial record. None of them were confirmed by documentation of any kind. But they were told and retold in that neighborhood with the consistency of things that people know to be true even when they cannot prove them. Being saved does not clean a man's hands. It does not reach back into the past and rearrange what was done or what was almost done. Clara grew up healthy. Her father grew old somewhere away from New York, and the $60,000 that bought her life came from a man he had been paid to kill. That is not redemption. That is not justice. That is simply the way the weight of a debt settles into a man's bones and stays there for the rest of his life. Present in every quiet moment, in every ordinary morning, in every breath his daughter takes that would not have existed without the decision of a man he once stood 3 feet behind with his hand inside his jacket. Being saved is not the same as being forgiven. The past does not negotiate. It simply waits. 1968. A small restaurant on 8th Avenue in Harlem, the kind of place with 4 tables, a counter along one wall, coffee that had been burning on the burner since 6 in the morning, and a radio in the kitchen playing something nobody was really listening to. The smell of frying eggs and cigarette smoke and the faint sweetness of someone's aftershave mixing together in the warm air near the door. Bumpy Johnson was sitting at a table near the back, eating breakfast, when his heart stopped. He was 62 years old. He had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 prison sentences, 30 years at the center of the most contested piece of urban territory in America, and the specific kind of slow violence that comes from living in permanent opposition to forces that wanted him dead. Controlled, or erased. He had outlasted enemies, partners, rivals, and the men who had been sent to finish him. He died eating breakfast on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a restaurant he had probably been to 100 times. The paramedics were called at 8:47 a.m. He was pronounced dead before they got him out the door. 1 year earlier, in 1967, Vito Genovese had been sitting in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, where he had been since 1959 following a narcotics conviction. He had run his organization from inside prison for nearly a decade. Phone calls, coded messages, men who came to visit and left with instructions. But the distance had done what the Coffin on Mulberry Street had started. Authority operated on presence, on the physical reality of a man in a room. Running an empire through prison walls was like trying to hold water in a closed fist. Some of it always leaked through. Genovese died in prison on February 14, 1969. He was 71 years old. His obituary in the New York Times confirmed his death and summarized his criminal history in the measured language of record. It did not mention a coffin on Mulberry Street. It did not mention a recording device or a hitman or a desperate father in a hospital hallway. Those details lived somewhere else entirely in the memories of the men who had been in those rooms and had never fully stopped carrying what they witnessed. When two men who defined the shape of a city's underworld disappear within a year of each other, the question that always follows is whether the structure they built disappears with them. The answer, in this case, was no and yes. Harlem continued. The numbers ran. The streets reorganized under new names and new arrangements. The city absorbed the vacancy the way a body absorbs a wound, closing around it. Scar tissue forming. The surface eventually going smooth. But the story about the coffin did not go away. It moved the way certain stories move, not through newspapers or official records, but through the specific oral tradition of people who were present, or knew someone who was present, or heard it from someone who had been in that card room on Mulberry Street on the night a dead man arrived alive and started talking. Every time the story was told, the details sharpened rather than blurred, the way true things do when they pass between people who lived through them. The exact particulars of that night may exist only in the accounts of men who are long gone. No document confirms the coffin. No record names the hitman or transcribes what the recording contained. What is confirmed is the outcome, a structure that survived intact, a retaliation that never came, a power that was challenged through intelligence rather than violence and held its ground completely. Real power is not measured by the fear a man creates while he is alive. Any man with enough money and enough willingness to hurt people can generate fear. Fear is the cheapest currency in that world, and it spends fast. Real power is measured by what remains after the man is gone. It is measured in the stories that keep being told, not because people are required to tell them, but because something in the telling still carries weight, still means something, still explains something about the way the world actually works underneath the version of it that gets written down. Bumpy Johnson died at a breakfast table in Harlem. Vito Genovese died in a federal prison in Atlanta. One of them sent a killer and received a coffin in return. One of them turned that coffin into a lever that moved things too large to move by force. Decades later, people still say his name in Harlem, not with fear, with something that does not have a simple word, a recognition that the man understood power at a level that most people who seek it never reach. He never needed them to be afraid of him while he was alive. He just needed them to still be talking about him after he was gone, and they are. The records show the dates they died, nothing more. They do not show the night a coffin rolled through a back door in Little Italy. They do not show a recording device running in the dark while powerful men plan to erase the people they had already used. The files close. The ink dries. The official version moves on. But some things are too precise to be coincidence and too heavy to be forgotten. If that night in 1957 happened exactly the way those men described it, Bumpy Johnson didn't win with a gun. He won with control. He made Genovese's own soldiers question the man they had built their lives around. That is not a wound. That is a collapse. Real power is not who you can kill. It is making your enemy understand they already lost before they ever pulled the trigger. Harlem never had just one secret. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.